Hi folks, welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel on the second Advent Sunday. I want to speak with you today about the origins of COVID-19, what I have stated in the past about it, and the fact that multivariate complex problems have no simplistic answers. So in order for me to delve into these issues with you, things are going to get complex by necessity. So please stick with me through to the end. I'll try not to make it too tedious. The Cassandra metaphor is a term given to situations where legitimate warnings are either dismissed for being too fantastic or disbelieved because they challenge the commonly held narrative. The metaphor originated in Greek mythology and referred to Cassandra, who was the daughter of Priam, the king of Troy. The Greek god Apollo was overcome by her beauty, and so gave Cassandra the gift of prophecy. However, when Cassandra rejected Apollo's romantic overtures, he cursed her prophecies so that no one would believe her warnings. This left Cassandra fatalistically knowing that disaster and ruin were impending, yet unable to do anything to stop them. And I provide the link from which I am about to quote now. It will be in the notes. The metaphor has been applied in a variety of contexts, such as psychology, environmentalism, politics, science, cinema, the corporate world, and in philosophy, and has been in circulation since at least 1949, when French philosopher Gaston Bachelard coined the term Cassandra complex to refer to a belief that things could be known in advance. In psychology, the Cassandra metaphor is applied by some psychologists to individuals who experience physical and emotional suffering as a result of distressing personal perceptions, and who are disbelieved when they attempt to share the cause of their sufferings with others. And I'm certain there are many of you out there who have been warning your family and friends who are experiencing that type of psychological suffering. Disability and neurodivergence. Many people on the autism spectrum and people with disabilities have suffered abuse and died at the hands of caregivers and institutions as a result of not being believed when they attempt to communicate their experience of abuse. Professionals contribute to this when they dismiss signs of trauma and distress as symptoms of the person's diagnosed condition. This reflects a larger problem of professionals neglecting to get to know neurodivergent and disabled persons as individuals with important perspectives and insights, instead viewing them through the experience-distant diagnostic criteria. Paradoxically, the Cassandra syndrome has been conceived to apply to neurotypical partners who try to communicate to professionals that the problem resides in their artistic partners when conflict arises between them. In this narrative, mental health professionals exacerbate the parties' troubles by blaming the distressed neurotypical partner for being an alarmist, for having inappropriate anxiety which feeds into problems, and for having unrealistic parenting expectations of the other parent. This is no more helpful than attributing problems solely to autistic partners. And on Melanie Klein. In 1963, psychologist Melanie Klein provided an interpretation of Cassandra as representing the human moral conscience whose main task is to issue warnings. Cassandra, as a moral conscience, predicts ill to come and warns that punishment will follow and grief arise. Cassandra's need to point out moral infringements and subsequent social consequences is driven by what Klein calls the destructive influence of the cruel superego, which is represented in the Greek myth by the god Apollo, Cassandra's overlord and persecutor. Klein's use of the metaphor centers on the moral nature of certain predictions, which tend to evoke in others a refusal to believe what at the same time they know to be true. and express a universal tendency toward denial, with denial being a potent defense against persecutory anxiety and guilt. End of quote. I know how Cassandra must have felt. Moreover, it is quite likely I exist somewhere on the autistic spectrum, with a probable candidate being Asperger's syndrome, on top of which I suffer from obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. But as they often say, just because you're crazy doesn't mean you haven't seen something that others may have often ignored. So, I have the sad comfort of knowing that in the unlikely event someone would care to check my warnings, they are all recorded on this channel. You will find that they have proven to be frighteningly accurate. In a recent interview between Dr. Jordan B. Peterson and Dr. Matt Ridley, they went into an in-depth look at the origins of COVID-19, and as I have been stating since early 2020, there are far too many smoking guns to believe that what the authorities were telling us was truthful. You may watch this interview here at, and I provide the link in the notes. Please watch it. It is a fascinating interview. Anyone who followed closely the story of Pfizer-BioNTech, its association with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, located at ground zero of the outbreak, the fact that the creation of mRNA technology and the emergence of COVID-19 coincide, that Canada, as well as the US and Great Britain, sent deadly live pathogens to that location, that Chinese scientists loyal to the CCP were detained by the RCMP for doing so, who had worked at our level 4 biopathogen lab in Winnipeg, and that high-level diplomats, whom I knew of, were aware that something was coming no later than September of 2019. This all indicates this wasn't a pandemic, but rather a plandemic. The following story was published by CBC on July the 14th, 2019. Remember that date, July the 4th, 2019, entitled Chinese Researcher Escorted from Infectious Disease Lab Amid RCMP Investigation. Again, I provide the link, and now I read from that article. A researcher with ties to China was recently escorted out of the National Microbiology Lab, NML, in Winnipeg amid an RCMP investigation into what's being described as a possible policy breach. Dr. Zhang Kui, her husband Kading Cheng, and an unknown number of her students from China were removed from Canada's only level 4 lab on July the 5th. CBC News has learned. A level 4 virology lab is a lab equipped to work with the most serious and deadly human and animal diseases. That makes the Arlington Street lab one of only a handful in North America capable of handling pathogens requiring the highest level of containment, such as Ebola. Security access for the couple and the Chinese students was revoked, according to sources who work at the lab and do not want to be identified because they fear consequences for speaking out. Sources say this comes several months after IT specialists for the NML entered Kui's office after hours and replaced her computer. Her regular trips to China also started being denied. At meetings on July the 8th, NML staff were told the researchers are on leave for an unknown period of time. They were told not to communicate with them. Kui is a prominent biologist who developed ZMapp, a treatment for the deadly Ebola virus, which killed more than 11,000 people in West Africa between 2014 and 2016. She worked with Gary Kobinger, who is now professor at the Department of Microbiology and Infectious Diseases and director of the Research Center on Infectious Diseases at Laval University in Quebec. Affiliated with Chinese University, Kui is a medical doctor from Tianjin, China, who came to Canada for graduate studies in 1996. She is still affiliated with the university there and has brought in many students over the years to help with her work. Currently head of the vaccine development and antiviral therapy section in the special pathogens program at the lab, Qui's primary field is immunology. Her research focuses on vaccine development, post-exposure therapeutics, and rapid diagnostics of viruses like Ebola. She is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Medical Microbiology at the University of Manitoba. Cheng also worked at the lab as a biologist. He has published research papers on HIV infections, severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, E. coli infections, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome. End of quote. And let us also look at the following. Weaponizing medicine. China's latest theft, a potential biological weapon, by Christopher Burgess, published August 15th, 2019. And again, I provide the link for that article, and I begin to read from it. On the heels of finding that the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, had its Level 3 and 4 biological research labs sanctioned by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we learned that many of the same viruses that USAMRIID was researching are on their way to China courtesy of a Canadian laboratory. In early July 2019, Wen Xiangguo Kui, a Chinese scientist at the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg, was dismissed, and her ties with the University of Manitoba cut. What makes this somewhat unusual is that Kui is recognized globally as one of the leading researchers on infectious diseases. Furthermore, Kui is credited with being instrumental in creating a new drug for treating the Ebola virus. Despite her accomplishments, the CBC reports that Kui, her husband Kading Cheng, and her students were forcibly dispatched from the facility on July the 5th. In response to pathogen samples being sent to China, the National Microbiology Laboratory spokesperson commented, "To advance scientific work worldwide, the National Microbiology Laboratory routinely shares samples of pathogens and toxins with partner laboratories in Canada and in other countries. These transfers follow strict protocols." From Canada to China with love. Nipah virus and Ebola. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are investigating the sharing of Ebola as well as the second pathogen, Nipah virus, which in real life kills 100% of those infected. While the lab claims this is normal and is part of the global research into deadly pathogens, the potential transfer of knowledge to China may be advancing their biological weapons program. In a research paper published by the National Institutes of Health, National Library of Medicine, the authors note, continued outbreaks of Nipah viruses in South Asia and Australia cause severe and lethal disease in both humans and animals. Together with evidence of human-to-human transmission for Nipah virus and the lack of preventative or therapeutic measures, its threat to cause a widespread outbreak and its potential for weaponization has increased. Providing the Nipah virus to China would seem to feed the weaponization narrative. One could also argue that given the proximity of the Nipah virus outbreaks in South Asia, research into treatment is a high priority for China. Intellectual property theft of the virus? The Ebola treatment drug, ZMapp, in which Kui had a collaborative hand, had already been cloned, pun intended, by a Chinese company, even though the experimental drug was under patent. The Chinese firm, MapWorks, admitted they had duplicated the drug without authorization and then continued working with researchers in Canada. Digging into Kui's dismissal, coupled with the obtuse and contradictory statements coming out of named and unnamed sources to the Canadian press, the worst-case scenario is that Kui, her husband, and research students made possible an unauthorized transfer of technology and deadly pathogens to China. The other end of the spectrum has Cui being investigated for administrative lapses which exposed intellectual property to a foreign entity in an unauthorized manner, though without malice or interest in advancing China's biological weapons program, nor putting coin into her own pocket. Bottom line, China now has samples of the Henipavirus and research from the Canadian National Lab, which may be useful in advancing China's biological weapons program, occurring at a time that the USAMRIID Defensive Biological Research Lab is shut down. End of quote. Now I begin again with my own thoughts. They did much worse than weaponize medicine. Yes, they took it even further than developing a bioweapon. They politicized medicine to use it as a tool to further the dialectical materialism of a full-blown communist revolution. COVID-19 became the primary motivation for the largest transference of wealth in human history from the common person to the elite who seek to control everything. I've never trusted the state, ever. Only a fool would, or perhaps someone who uses the state's apparatus to their own manipulative ends. But I'll do one better. People who do so are responsible for creating totalitarian regimes. It is that simple. Each and every time totalitarianism has emerged, the leaders of the revolution simply told a sufficient number of their citizens what they wanted to hear to foment said revolution. So what people who have placed their faith in big government have done here in Canada is unconscionable. Christians often fall prey to the simplistic belief that Bible prophecies refer to one specific event in history that will never be repeated. They who do so forget that the Bible, like Greek mythology, is full of metaphorical truths about human nature, mass psychology, and the psychic events which ensue from that mass formation. Everything that will happen has also happened in similar fashion in the past, albeit on a much smaller scale. The story of the Tower of Babel refers to what invariably happens when a sufficiently large number of people place their faith in the state apparatus, which is then destined to collapse under its own weight in confusion. We have replaced Father God with Mother Government, and she is an unholy, idolatrous mother who has but one goal: to feed off her offspring like a succubus. And mankind's worship of her always has been, is, and always will be idolatry. So there are a few things to think and pray about on this second Advent Sunday. God bless you all, and don't participate in this incredible, vast lie, this mass psychic formation of a poisoned mindset that seeks to enslave humanity.